Have you ever wondered how to make custom sleeve PC cables? Well, today I'm going to show you how. Now, custom cable sleeving might sound complicated, but it actually isn't. It is in fact time consuming, especially if you have a custom cable tray like this one. Now, if you want to make your own custom sleeve cables, you'll need the following tools. Now, first up, you'll need some good quality side cutters, sharp scissors, needle nose pliers, utility knife, and a lighter. By the way, I will link all of the tools and supplies that you will need in the description below. Now, next up is a good quality wire stripper. The one I'm using is from Knipex. It is very easy to use and it gives great results. I highly recommend it. It would also help to have this type of wire stripper, especially for the split wires. It's not completely necessary, but it will make your life a lot easier. The next tool is probably the most important one, and that's a crimper. This crimper is from MDPC-X and it's absolutely amazing. It gives you perfect crimps and it's definitely worth every cent. You will then need ATX and Molex pin removers. Both these are from MDPC-X and they are quite cheap. Definitely a must have, especially if you made a mistake. Now, the last two that will help but isn't completely necessary is a heat gun and a multimeter. Now, with the tools out of the way, let's talk about what supplies you're going to need. Now, first off, you'll need some wire. All of the wires that I use are from MDPC-X and I only use 2 different gauges of wire throughout my entire build. 15 gauge for all of the power supply cables and 23 gauge for all of my fan and RGB cables. Now, 16 gauge wire is more than sufficient for all of your power supply cables. You can even use 18 gauge wire for your peripherals, but I like to use 15 gauge. It's just easier to sleeve. Now, the next thing you will need is sleeving, and the one major advantage for only using 15 and 23 gauge wire is that you only need one size of sleeving. I am using XTC sleeving from MDPC-X and it works perfect with a single 15 gauge wire as well as 23 gauge wire bundled together in pairs of 3 and 4. Now, next up is connectors and crimp terminals. Now, if you're planning on making cables from scratch like I am, then you only need female connectors. But if you're planning on making extensions, then you'll need male and female connectors. Now, for the power supply and motherboard, you'll need these ATX connectors. For the graphics card, you'll need these PCIe connectors. Now, luckily, all of these connectors will use the exact same ATX crimping terminals. Now, if you want to make custom cables for your peripherals as well, you also need some Molex and SATA connectors with their crimp terminals. And if you want to take it one step further and make custom fan and LED cables, you also need some 3 or 4 pin fan connectors, and depending on what RGB controller you use, you also need some connectors for that. I'll be using the Fantex controller and they use standard JST 3-way connectors. And last but definitely not the least, you also need these non-insulated blade or ring terminals that we're going to use to make our split wires. You will then need some heat shrink and loads of it. You'll need some heat shrink to insulate and you'll also need some heat shrink to melt the sleeving to the crimp terminals. Now, for that, I'll use clear heat shrink from MDPC-X. It's not completely necessary, but it makes it way easier, especially when you're doing it for the first time. And last but definitely not the least, you'll need something to keep the cables together and neat. And for that, you'll use cable combs. The rule of thumb is that you'll need 1 cable comb every 100 millimeters. And by the way, I designed and laser cut these cable combs myself. If you want to make them, you can download the cut files for free. Just look for the link in the description below. Now, before you can actually start making the cables, there's one more thing you'll need, and that is the pinout diagram for your power supply. Now, you can find this on your power supplies manufacturer's website, or you can search for the make and model of your power supply. If you still can't find it, then you can use the original cables that came with the power supply with a multimeter to map out the pinout diagram. Now, I'll link this free pinout diagram template from Mr. Alex Banks, as well as the one I made for my MSI power supply in the description below. Now, with all that said and done, I think it's finally time to make some cables. Now, to demonstrate my process, I'm going to show you step by step how to make the GPU cables for this build. I need to make 3 8-pin PCIe cables for the GPU that will run through the same channel. Starting here, going through this bracket, in here, all the way around, through here, and up to the power supply. Now the first step is to determine the length of the cable. Now how I'm going to do that is by using the same wire that the cable is going to be made out of and route it through the channel where the cable actually is going to sit. I then route the wire starting at the PSU, all the way through the channel until it reaches the GPU. I'll then add about 5 to 10 centimeters to the length of the wire and cut it. In this case, I'll route 2 wires, one on each side of the channel. I'll then compare the lengths of the 2 wires and choose the longest one between the two as the reference wire. I'll then cut all of the other wires for this cable to this length. This is also a good method to calculate how much wire you will need in total. Just use the length of the test wire and multiply it by the number of wires you need to finish the cable. You then repeat this process for all of the other cables as well. The total length of all of the cables will then be equal to the amount of wire you will actually need. I always add an additional 10 meters of wire just to be on the safe side. Now with all the wires cut to length, the next step is to crimp. And we're only going to crimp the one side of the wire. We're then going to sleeve it and then crimp the other side once it's already inserted into the PC. To make the crimp, you're going to have to strip about 3 to 4 millimeters of insulation off of the wire. I usually try to strip the insulation so that the wire just slightly surpasses the crimp section. Just make sure that the bare wire does not go into the terminal where it could actually interfere with the male pin. I then use my pliers and slightly squeeze the crimp arms over the insulation, just enough so that the terminal doesn't fall off. I then carefully place the terminal into the crimp tool, making sure that the wire as well as the terminal are completely straight, and then I press down to crimp it. And if you did it correctly, your crimp should look like this. And you can always do a pull test just to make sure it's on correctly. Now you only have to repeat this 23 times. With all of the wires crimped on the one end, we can finally move on to sleeving them. The length of the sleeve should be slightly longer than the wire itself, starting from the crimp section and extending about 5 millimeters past the end of the wire. Once you cut it, use your lighter to melt the end of the sleeve, just to keep it intact. Once ready, you slide the sleeving over the wire. Once the sleeving is on, the next step is to mount the sleeving to the crimp terminal. To get a good bond between the sleeving and the terminal, the sleeving should only cover half of the wire crimp section. Once the sleeving is in position, place the heat shrink over the sleeve and the terminal and then use your lighter to melt it. Don't be scared to place it directly into the flame, and keep on heating it while you turn the wire until you can see the sleeve melting. Once melted, wait a few seconds, then remove the heat shrink. And it should look like this when you're done. Just keep in mind that the melted sleeving should not go past the crimp section. If it does, it might interfere with the connector. With the one side melted, you can now pull the sleeve tight, then use your lighter and melt the end, and then quickly form the sleeving so that it closes off with a rounded point like this. This will make it a lot easier when it comes to routing the wire. I'm now going to repeat the melting process with a normal piece of heat shrink that isn't see-through. You're going to want to heat up the heat shrink to the point where it actually starts to bubble. When you see the bubbles, you know you can basically stop. And that's basically perfect. Now just to repeat it for all of the other wires. Now with the wires done, I'm going to start by routing it through the channels, starting at the GPU and working my way around until I reach the power supply. To make it a little bit easier, just before I start to route the wires, I first use a cable comb to arrange them and then go ahead and insert them into their PCIe connectors. I'm finally done routing all of these wires, and as you can see they are way too long. So my next step will be to trim them all down, do a mock-up, and only then start crimping. Now I'm going to start with the cable that's going to travel the shortest distance and has the tightest bend, and that's basically going to be this one. So I'll trim it, do a mock-up, repeat it for the other 2 cables, and only when I'm happy with how everything looks, then I'll start crimping. If you want to trim your wires to the correct length, you actually have to know where they're going to terminate to, and therefore you have to start paying attention to your wiring diagram. The wiring diagram for my power supply shows that the 8-pin PCIe connectors that I'm currently busy with is quite straightforward, with a 1-to-1 pin out, with the exception being pin 4 and 8 that needs to terminate into 1 pin on the power supply side. Now you've got 2 options to do this. You can either run 1 wire and make a split connection at the GPU side, or you can run 2 wires and make a split connection at the power supply side. For aesthetic reasons, I chose to run 2 wires. Now I will show you how to make the split connection once we start crimping the terminals. Okay, I'm finally happy with it, so I'm going to start crimping, and the crimping process is exactly the same as before. No matter what power supply you use, you will most likely have to make split wires. Let's take the pinout diagram for my power supply as an example. When you look at the motherboard's power cables, you will see that you have a 24-pin ATX connector on the motherboard side that will terminate into a 18-pin and 10-pin ATX connector on the power supply side. Now most of the wires pretty much have a 1-to-1 pinout, except for a few split connections like pin number 5, 6, 10 and 12. If you take a closer look at pin number 12, you will see that it has to terminate into 2 pins on the power supply side, and pin number 10 has to terminate into 2 different connectors, and therefore we need split wire connections. Over the years I've tried several different methods to make split wires. The one I'm going to show you is by far the easiest and most reliable. To demonstrate the process, let's say that this is the wire coming from your 12 pin of your motherboard connector, already trimmed to the correct length, and this is the extension piece that needs to terminate at your second number 12 pin, also trimmed to the correct length. And to join the 2 wires together, we will use this non-insulated crimp terminal. Now we will only need the crimp section, so you can cut off the ring piece. Now the first step is to place the extension piece next to the main wire to determine the placement of the split. Use your nibs and cut the sleeving about 5 mm away from where the split needs to be. Use your lighter to melt the end of the sleeving, making sure not to damage the insulation of the wire. Now use this type of wire stripper and cut through the insulation at the beginning of the split. Make sure you use the correct size on the stripper so you won't damage the wire strands. Move the stripper over about 5 mm and cut through the insulation again. The distance between the 2 cuts should be slightly larger than the wire crimp section of your terminal. Now take your utility knife and remove the insulation between the 2 cuts. Then take your extension wire piece and strip the insulation off the one side, again to the same length as the wire crimp section of the terminal. Now place both wires into the crimp terminal. Make sure they are correctly aligned and then carefully place it into your crimping tool to crimp it. Now the 2 wires together are quite thick, so the tool might not be able to close all the way, but that isn't a problem. Just press the release lever on the tool to open the crimper again. And there you have a perfect secure connection. Now you really don't have to, but I always solder the connection as well. But if you have done everything correctly, the crimp should be more than enough. I then cover the connection with a piece of heat shrink. With the connection done, the only thing left to do is to crimp the 2 ends and sleeve them. I first crimp both ends, cut the sleeving to the correct length, add the sleeving, mount the sleeving to the 2 terminals, and then use some heat shrink on the opposite side to keep them in place. Once the extension pieces are done, I then pull the original sleeving piece as tight as possible and then use some more heat shrink to keep it in place. And to finish the connection off, I use another piece of heat shrink to cover the entire connection. And then you're basically done. Now let's get back to finishing the rest of the wires. And just like that, the GPU cables are done. But let's say you want to take it one step further and make custom LED and fan cables. Well, let me show you how. To demonstrate the LED and fan sleeving, I'll be using a Fantex D30 fan. These come with the single connector for both the LED and fan power. Now first off, you can either use the existing wires or you can solder the new 23 gauge wires to them. And for the demonstration, I'll just use the existing wires. Now before you do anything else, make sure you know what the pinout diagram of the fans and LEDs are. You can use your multimeter and determine the pinout of each connector. Once you have it, you can then start by cutting the wires to the required length. Then you can measure out the sleeving. It's usually slightly shorter than the wire itself. Cut the sleeving, melt the ends and then insert the wires into it. You will need 2 pieces of heat shrink to keep the sleeving tight. Place them over the sleeving before you start to add the connectors. We will shrink them once we've added the connectors. Now the next step is to crimp the wires. I'm using a 4-pin fan connector for the fan power and a JST 3-pin connector for the LEDs. Once they are crimped, use your pinout diagram and insert all of the terminals into the connectors. Now with the wires terminated, pull your sleeving tight and shrink the heat shrink on both ends of the wire, making sure that the sleeving is as tight as possible. And just like that, you have custom sleeved fan and LED cables. Now that's everything you need to know to make your own custom PC cables. Well, everything I know of. If you've got any sleeving tips and tricks that makes the process faster or easier, please share them in the comment section below. If you want to see the final reveal of this build, follow the link up here to go and watch it. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a like. Until next time, thank you for watching.